ICS3U. This video is actually taking up a warm-up. We don't have any many videos that take up warm-ups, but this one's worth it. It's a walkthrough. We did a couple of walkthroughs in the first programming unit, and it was pretty tough, so let's practice this one. Remember the idea of a warm-up, and you've tried this. You're not just watching this video. You've tried this, I hope. And if you haven't, you should stop and try the note. The walkthrough has a bunch of pieces to it. These things are all things that are going to end up in my program being put into memory. This is kind of like the memory part, and then we have the output part, and the two pieces together form the walkthrough. There are actually other variables that go into memory that we never even mention. Things like FR is actually a variable of type file reader that goes into memory. BR is a variable of type buffered reader that goes into memory, but it doesn't change. And we know now that these FR and BR are to set up our access to the file student.dat. And student.dat is actually this little text file that I have open there, and that's going to provide us input to our program. So that's what happens. So the first things, so after I set up my file reader and my buffered reader, then I go into the string, and that gets put into memory. So that was the first memory line that I had. No initial value, right? So name didn't have an initial value. And then mark str, whatever. And notice that my comments here sort of tell me what these are going to be used for. The student's mark read in from a file as a string. So when I read the student mark as a string, it goes into this variable, or at least it's going to. It's not yet. Integer mark total equals 0. Now notice this has an initial value of 0, so total is the first value in memory to actually have a value. First variable in memory to actually have a value. Num of students is the number of records in the file, even though we don't know that yet. Num of students goes into this memory, and it's blank right now. This is the line we're on right now. And then the first sort of interesting line is this one. It says num of students equals integer dot parseInt bracket br read line bracket bracket. Well, what is that doing? Well, it's changing from whatever this input is. This is a string, right? And it's parsing it to an integer. Well, what is it parsing? It's parsing br.readline. BR is our buffered reader that's hooked up to the student file. So it's actually going to go to this file and read off 2. So this is the string value 2. Notice that value there doesn't actually get read in at all. It goes straight into this method, integer.parseInt of the string 2. So even though I don't want to leave this, it's kind of like it's doing this, right? It's read that 2 in from the file. I'm going to undo that so we can have that come back. And so what does that mean? Num of students actually is the number 2, not the string 2, but it gets parsed from a string into an integer. And notice there are comments that says that. Reads the first line of the file and parses it into an integer, and it's an example of a compound statement. Compound statement are sort of two statements that have been smashed into one. That's one of them, and this is the second one, and it gets assigned a num of students. Fine. And then what happens? Well, we start into a for loop, right? So this for loop, for int I equals 1. Aha! That is a new value. So I goes into memory and actually has the value 1. And then it checks the condition. I is less than or equal to num of students, and since that's true, it's going to go through the loop, right? So it's going to go through the loop. The first line in the loop right here is name equals br.readline. So br.readline goes to br, which is our buffered reader, which is hooked up to our file, and then grabs that next line, which happens to be a name. We planned it that way. So that means name becomes Ferd. And that's that line right there. The next line, we're entering a new loop. This one right here, this line right here, for int j equals 1. So j is a new variable. It's an integer, and has the starting value of 1. And it checks, is j less than or equal to 4? And since it is, it goes into this loop. So we're inside a second loop, a nested for loop. And it goes mark str equals br.readline. So what is this doing? br.readline is reading the next line of the file into this variable mark str. And notice that when it reads it in from a file, this is a string. And so then this is a string, and that's why we had mark str as a string, and that was the next line. This was actually the string 56. Sometimes we put quotes around the 56 to show that it's a string instead of a number. Then what's the next line? It says mark equals integer.parseInt of mark str. So that means mark gets parsed from the string into a number 56 and then assigned to that memory location, that memory variable right there. And then total equals total plus mark. We start adding up the total. So total, which was 0, plus mark, which is 56. Notice we didn't use mark string because that would have given us an error. And then total becomes 56. Ends the loop, increments j, so then j becomes 2, right? Increments j, checks the condition. Is j still less than or equal to 4? Yes, it is. So the next step then, since this is true, it's going to do this inside loop again. It reads in the next line of the file, which is 72, as a string, parses it to an integer on the next line, parses it to an integer, and then accumulates total equals total plus mark. So total is right now 56. Mark was 72, right? Because mark is 72, so it goes 56 plus 72, 128. And then it gets to the end of the loop, goes back up here, increments j, and then we're off to the races again. Okay? I'm not going to take it all up. Probably I've posted the solution for this, but I'll let you have a quick look and you can pause. The solution's probably posted on Edmodo somewhere. You just have to look for it. There's the rest. It works exactly like you would expect. Maybe I'll end up here at the end of this first loop. So J goes through when it's 2, and then it gets incremented to 3. It reads in 39. When it's 4, it reads in 80. Everything's working great. It's adding up the total, and then it increments J to 5, then tests the condition, and finally it's not true anymore. So when it's not true anymore, it conks out of this inside loop here, conks out of this inside loop, and then goes to this line, system.out.println, name plus average was double total slash 4. What did that do? Well, that calculated the average, didn't it? And then there's your output. Ferd's average was 61.75. And then the next line sets total equals 0. What's this line for? Well, hopefully you figured that out. That's to reset the total so that the next line through, which is going to be the next person in the file, it'll work. And then so it gets to this loop, goes back up here, increments I is the next thing, increments I, the second person, and then checks the condition. Is I less than or equal to the num of students? Well, num of students was read in earlier to be 2. Is 2 less than or equal to 2? Yes, it is. This is true, so it's going to go through that very same process we went with Ferd for Ferdette. Bang, 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 bang. There's all the values, and her average was 80.25. And that's the walkthrough. Very important skill in computer science. Now, I do have some other comments I want to make about this thing that you'll want to get into this file that you've got here. And here, where is it? Where is the? Did I put them at the end here? Where are my comments? Let me go find my comments here. Found them. Here they are. So you're typing along with me. The post walkthrough notes with Restall about this program, and I mentioned this, but it's important to get into our notes. Whoops. Is that compound statements reduce the number of lines of code and reduce the number of variables needed, which might be a little more efficient memory-wise, but the code becomes more difficult to read and often then more difficult to maintain. So and there was an example there, the compound statement num of students equals integer.parseInt, we said that that's two pieces, one that read the string in and the second that changed it from a string to an integer. This is a compound statement. And it's a little bit difficult to read. Even all the brackets there make it look a little confusing. I could break it up, have a variable number of students string equals br.readline, so that just reads it from the file and puts it in a variable, and then that variable gets put into the parsing to change it from a string to an integer. This compound statement broken into these two substatements. Another example. We had our file reader and buffered reader, which is pretty familiar for us now. This is how we read stuff from files, the file reader and buffered reader. Often, because this FR business was just to connect to this file. So these two things can be combined. Where I had FR, I could just have this code that's on the right-hand side, and then I'd get a compound statement, which will look complicated, but really does the trick in one line. Buffered reader equals br.new buffered reader new, and it's combined, a compound statement. So, well, I can see how that's more difficult to read, more complex. What's the advantage of doing it this way? The advantage of doing this way, if you've got one fewer line of code, which is that good or bad? That doesn't matter. But what happens is you don't have this FR that's hanging around in memory. This inside thing is executed and the memory is released again. So you can think of, in huge programs, you're going to want to use as little memory as you want. So you might want these compound statements. For our purposes, generally we like to break it up so we can read it more easily. So it's probably better programming style to do it this way rather than that way. Okay, save up your walkthrough. Hopefully you had some success with that. Don't be afraid to ask if you didn't. The lesson will start here shortly, and I'll see you soon. Talk to you soon. Hear me soon.